Do you have no charge?
Yeah, I have my charger. Hi, everyone. It's you might want to mute yourself. So welcome. Is it me or is it? It's okay, right? Can everyone hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up? Awesome. So thank you guys so much for coming. I see a lot of familiar faces, so thank you to my team for showing up again. A lot of what we're talking about today is what we spoke about yesterday. And as you guys know, there are a lot of changes happening in this industry, and CJ and I are here to tell you it's going to be okay. So we're going to give you a lowdown on exactly what's going on. We're going to give you some tips and some strategies. We are going to help you get prepared because I am a really big believer that what's happening right now is a really good thing. So without further ado, I'm going to get started. And by the way, feel free to put your questions in the chat. You can also unmute yourself. So please feel free to do that and ask questions as we go. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Jordana Tobel. I'm the broker and owner of Premier Listings. I have been licensed, this is crazy, since 2006. Oh my God, almost 20 years. I'm so old. We have offices in Palm Beach, in Broward, and Brevard. And I'm really pleased to be on this call today and sharing with you guys information that I think is going to help all of us prepare. And we have CJ, who I will let introduce himself.
Hi, everybody. This is Charles Esposito from JK Closing Attorneys. I'm the owner and managing attorney at JK Closings. And Jordana and I hopefully will be talking today about how the sky is not falling.
Contrary to popular belief.
Yes.
Okay. So the verdict is in. If you haven't heard, I want to make sure you realize that the old way of doing business is over. Here's the good news. The good news is that together we can conquer this market and the challenges, and we can prepare for the opportunities that are coming. Because again, that's the key word. If you ask me, it's all about the opportunity. So here's what happened. On October 31st, the National Association of Realtors, Home Services of America, and Keller Williams were found liable. Essentially, they were found liable for inflating realtor commissions. Now, here's the thing that we all need to understand. This is not the only lawsuit. There were a series of lawsuits. There is the Moeller lawsuit, which is coming in January 2024, as far as that's when the trial is set to begin. And another key thing is that immediately after the verdict came out, 30 minutes later, another lawsuit was filed. This is now being called the Gibson lawsuit. This lawsuit has named Compass, EXP, Howard Hanna, Douglas Elliman, Weichert, and United. And guess what? It's nationwide, whereas the Sitzer Burnett lawsuit was just in Missouri. So this includes all of us. And what it basically argues is that we, as real estate professionals, members of NAR, and these brokerages and the MLSs are all colluding and conspiring to make sellers pay more in commissions. So here's what we're going to talk about. Now that that verdict has come out, and now that we know that essentially we were found guilty of those things. We were found guilty of colluding. We were found guilty of conspiring. And this is going to impact the industry in a massive, massive way. So the three main questions that I know you guys are asking, because I was asking it myself. Number one, is buyer representation going away? Number two, what can we do to prepare, including what not to do? And number three, what changes can you expect? So before I start to go into that, any questions on any of the verdicts that have come out or the upcoming lawsuits that are happening? One thing I want to say is that as of this morning, there was an article that the DOJ and the attorneys that represented the plaintiffs were in conversation yesterday afternoon. And this is about the Gibson lawsuit, which is potentially a $200 billion. That's what they're predicting is going to be the amount. So understand that with the Sitzer Burnett lawsuit, the total damages were about, I think it was 1.78 million. Oh, sorry. Not million, billion with a B. And then because it's class action, something happens called treble. And in the treble, it essentially means it's 3 times that, which is going to amount to about $5 billion in damages. So this other lawsuit, the Gibson lawsuit, again, they're predicting it's going to be about $200 billion. And it's the same idea. which is essentially that we are conspiring to inflate broker commissions. And by the way, the MLS is considered a vehicle of this because most MLSs have required compensation in every single listing, even though it was only $1. So if you haven't already received communication from your MLS, the rules have changed already that you can now put $0 or 0% in the cooperating commission section. So let's talk about if it's the end of the real estate world as we know it. The answer is no, it is not. And buyer agency is not going to go away, contrary to the fear that's out there. Do not listen. They are wrong. Mark my words, this is going to be better for all of us. So if it didn't work, or you can ask Courtney to maybe help you. Yeah. So the answer to the question, if buyer agency is going away, the answer is no. And let me give you some stats and some numbers to help explain why. In 2001, how many realtors do you think, or sorry, how many buyers do you think used realtors to represent them on the buy side? Take a guess in the chat.
Percentage-wise, let's hear it.
Percentage-wise. I mean, my team knows the answer, so you guys don't. Well, everyone's being a little shy. No need to be shy, but let's see. Here we go. Matt is saying 98.
98%.
Alicia is saying 90. So believe it or not, 95.
This is 2001, 22 years ago.
Eleanor is saying 99. So understand in 2001, you guys, this is before Zillow. It's before all of those online portals. So this is what I find to be so interesting. Karen is saying 100. Nope, it's 69%. So not a huge percentage. Not everyone used realtors. But understand, when Zillow came out, when all of the online portals came out, everybody panicked. Everyone thought, oh my gosh, Zillow is going to ruin realtors. They don't need realtors anymore, right? That's what we thought. But understand that in 2001, only about 70% of buyers use realtors. And guess what that number is today? That number is 88%. So essentially, more people are using realtors today than they did before, even though we have Zillow, we have various online portals, we have realtor.com. The internet is used way more than it was in 2001. So my point being, people still need realtors. Everyone needs to understand that. You guys need to understand that the general public they're not in the real estate world on a day-to-day basis. They will buy or sell a house on average 2 to 3 times in their lifetime. Do you think that they want to handle all of that on their own? Another interesting stat, in the 1960s, about 30% of households had dual income, meaning both partners worked. Only 30%. Today, it's more like 70% of households have dual income. So what that tells me is that most households are busy. Everyone has a life. They have work to do. They have families. They have children. They do not know what it takes to buy a home. They don't have that expertise. They still need a realtor. And guess what? It is becoming more and more complex with the market changing as frequently as it does, with interest rates being complicated with different loan products. This is not an easy transaction. And the reason why I'm telling all of you this is because people still need us. Just because of the verdict on Halloween, that does not mean that we are not going to get compensated anymore. It just means that the way we get compensated is going to change. It just means that all of us have to be better at what we do, and we have to be professionals. Will there be agents that are going to leave the industry? There is going to be massive attrition. I'm predicting between 20 and 40% of realtors are going to leave the industry. Why? Because they are not going to be educated. They are not going to be informed. They don't have a broker like me. They don't have the wherewithal to be able to have tough conversations with buyers and sellers to explain these recent changes and how that impacts their wallet and their bottom line. So understand the importance of what you're doing by showing up here today and educating and informing yourself. You are actually going to be a better professional because of it. Some other stats that I think are really interesting. consumers are willing to pay. So there is a company, it's called 1000 Watts Consulting. And in August of 2023, they did a study with 1,000 homeowners that had just bought their home in the past 3 years. And here are the questions they asked. First of all, they asked if they would use their realtor again. 90% said they would. Then they were asked, did your agent get paid fairly or even too little? The majority of them said, yes, my agent got paid too little. Lastly, they were asked, would you be willing to sign an exclusive agreement? And would you be willing to pay for those services out of pocket? And about 75% said yes, they would. So what does this tell us? This tells us that it's okay that we're changing. For those of you guys that were around in 2008 when the market crashed, I don't know if you remember, there was this big lawsuit, there was this big legislation called the Dodd-Frank legislation. And everyone thought that was the end of mortgage brokers because that legislation essentially had all these new disclosures. If you were going to go and get a loan, your loan officer was now required to give you oodles and oodles of paperwork. Oodles isn't the right word, but lots and lots of paperwork for those disclosures. And guess what? The mortgage world did not die. It did not go away. People still need mortgage brokers. So the same thing is happening to us right now. And again, I'm a big believer that this is going to help us, not hurt us. So now that we know that there are going to be changes, and I also want to stop for a second and remind you guys that what we're doing today, even though I'm not an attorney and CJ is, we're giving you an opinion, but this is not over by any means. This is an ongoing conversation. There are going to be continued conversations, continued lawsuits, continued settlements, and things that are going to happen. Again, part of why it's so important that you, as a real estate professional, stay informed, stay up to date, continue to participate in conversations. And by the way, be aware of the conversations that you are participating in, because there's a lot of haters out there. There's a lot of fear, and that's not necessarily what you want to be a part of. You want to listen to the people that you trust and that you know are doing it from a professional standpoint. So
yeah, so Jordana, let me just comment on the case in general and what you just mentioned about this is going to be ongoing. So this Missouri case lasted for several years and we finally got a verdict on it. However, that does not mean that the case is over. There's going to be, from my understanding, several of the parties are going to go for a mistrial. And then if they are not granted the mistrial, they're going to appeal. They're going to appeal the actual decision and they're going to appeal the damages amount. Which just means that the case will continue on further. And as far as the legal ramifications for this, Jordana mentioned it earlier, but the MLS has changed so that there can be a 0% commission offered instead of, requiring a commission, which was $1 basically. So the practical effects of this are different than the legal effects. There's no new law that's changed or anything like that, but the perception of this lawsuit and the narrative that's coming from this lawsuit are going to lead to changes in the industry where we're already starting to see brokers say to their agents, you have to have a buyer broker representation agreement. We need to have certain disclosures for sellers in order to make sure that individual brokers are not going to be sued because their sellers start to say that it wasn't disclosed to them that they didn't have to pay a buyer broker commission. So it's going to be on you guys to be able to challenge that narrative that's coming out of this lawsuit. And then if there are laws that come down the pipeline, whether they're in Florida or they're national laws, pending what the national lawsuits are, we'll see. But right now there are no laws that have changed, and we might start to see more documents that already exist, whether they're buyer broker representation agreements or the showing agreement that Jordana, you and I just talked about before this presentation. Those might be seen more, and you guys need to educate yourselves as to what those documents say and how to use them. And I think that leads into what Jordana is going to talk about here with how do we prepare for these changes.
Right, exactly. So the first thing that all of us need to understand is you need to understand who you are and understand what your value is. So this number right here, this 179 number, can anyone guess what that is? 179. So what that 179 represents is that is the number of activities we do as realtors when we are working with a client, with a buyer or a seller. Let's see, we got some guesses. Oh yeah, number of tasks. That's right, Shara. So my point to you is you need to be able to better articulate your value, both with sellers and with buyers, especially with buyers. You are no longer going to be able to show them homes for weeks and weeks on end, and then all of a sudden they go and they want to buy a property that offers 0% commission, because you will get compensated 0. Unless you understand, and from the very beginning, you understand your value and you explain it to them. So Claudia, before we start working together, before I start showing you homes and doing research and hours of time and tasks for you, let me explain who I am and what I'm going to do for you. I'm going to help you buy this home. I'm going to do all of these things. And in turn, I need you to sign this agreement that I'm going to represent you. Those conversations are going to basically be needed every time you work with a buyer, which is my next point. All of you need to become masters of the buyer-broker agreement. So to start with, you're not going to be able to ask someone to sign something unless you can explain who you are, why they should sign to work with you, and then of course the terms of the buyer-broker agreement, right? So by understanding the terms of the agreement, you would now essentially have that tough conversation about compensation. So Jennifer, I'm happy to work with you and help you figure out which area is right for you, whether it's Boca or Delray, and which community is the perfect fit for your family. I charge 3% for that. And if you could go ahead and sign this buyer-broker agreement, this allows me to work with you. There's a huge amount of work that goes into this. And by the way, there's different ways that I could be compensated. Some sellers are going to offer commission and some won't. And if they don't offer compensation, your offer will include a stipulation that I will get paid accordingly. So we'll talk about that in a second. But you absolutely need to start reviewing, understanding, becoming an expert in the buyer broker and doing it every single time. Which leads me to my next point. The best way to do a buyer broker is to do a buyer presentation. So can you imagine, would any of you ever work with a seller if you didn't have a listing agreement signed? Absolutely not, right? Why would you work for free? Why would you help someone sell a home if there's no guarantee that you're going to get compensated for your time and your effort? So the same exact thing is now in play with a buyer. Why would you work for a buyer if you don't know if you're going to get paid or not? With this new lawsuit, there is no requirement for a seller to pay you to bring a buyer. Now, the truth is that there were always options for the seller, but again, the verdict essentially is saying that there wasn't enough being disclosed to the seller. There weren't enough options for them to offer 0%. So by conducting a buyer presentation, you're going to be able to do those first two things that I suggested, which is the first thing is articulate your value. Roni, this is why you need me to represent you, because the market is tough out there. You need a realtor that's going to go to bat for you. And that's who I am. I go above and beyond. Then you're going to need to be able to ask for the buyer broker. And that all is going to happen during your buyer consultation. So for the agents that are with Premier Listings, you know, we have a buyer consultation. I've been talking about this for months. We have training around it. If you don't have that as a resource, you don't have the training or a version of a buyer broker, or a buyer presentation, you want to get yourself one. Oh, sure. Let me stop for some questions. So the question is, if buyers, after you explain all of that, decide to get into contract directly with the listing agent, so Lydia, I'm not sure I completely understand. I mean, yes, buyers will have the choice. So if you ask a buyer broker, if you ask a buyer to sign and they don't want to sign, that's their choice. I think what you meant was, what happens if you have a signed buyer broker and then they go under contract? Is that what, and if that's the question, the answer is that buyer is now, they are contractually required to pay you.
Or if she's saying, I think maybe what she's saying is you explain that to them and then they don't want to sign with you. and they'll go talk to the seller directly.
Oh, okay.
But they have to find these properties. When a buyer contacts you, are they contacting you to go look for them for multiple properties or just one property?
But I have to say
Yeah.
also, so in that scenario, if you are talking to a buyer and saying, I would like for you to sign this, and they say, no, I'm going to go do this myself, my response is, well, good luck. That is not an easy thing to do. So this is part of why I like this new process. I like it because you're going to be able to know from the very beginning who actually appreciates you, who actually wants you to spend your time helping them negotiate. Can they go to the seller directly? They absolutely can. Will that happen? Yes. Now, will those people be protected if there's an issue during inspection? What if they want to cancel and they don't know how? I mean, what if there's another financing issue? What about scheduling the closing? So all of those things they are now going to have to do on their own. So to answer your question, they absolutely can, but that's part of why you need to understand all of the things that you do. And you need to tell those buyers that, hey, Roni, let me explain to you that in every single buyer transaction I've ever worked on, there have been multiple obstacles along the way. All of those obstacles, if there wasn't someone like me involved, me specifically, if I wasn't involved, that buyer would have never been able to close because they would not have known how to get over those obstacles. Now, the other part of it, which you might not have asked, but I want to explain, is that if you do have a buyer broker signed, and if they go under contract and they close, they have to pay you. So in my brokerage, we've had two different instances. One time Kyle had a buyer broker signed. He calls up the buyer who ghosted him, and the buyer says, oh, Kyle, I actually called the listing agent directly and I'm under contract. So I went ahead, I called that broker. They said, you're absolutely right. And we had an agreement where we got compensated because we had that buyer broker. I had another instance where this happened. And guess what? The buyer went to an on-site sales office at a development, and they went under contract. And they did not include us in that transaction. They went into their pocket and they paid us the 3% because they had a buyer broker. So understand the power of the buyer broker. So I hope, does that answer your question?
To follow up on that too, because someone has also asked, when will these changes take effect? The changes have already taken effect in the MLS. You do not need to offer a buyer commission in the MLS, but buyer commissions have always been negotiable. So these changes have already taken effect, and this is a narrative change now. Okay, NAR and Florida realtors and everybody, myself included, have always recommended to buyers to use the buyer broker representation agreement. It's just that buyers agents had this perception that they were always going to get paid compensation by a listing agent as a cooperating broker. But just like Jordana mentioned, that didn't happen all the time. Either the MLS listed something that wasn't 3%, could have been 2%, could have been 1%, or if it's a new construction has certain obstacles that need to be filled out by a buyer broker. For instance, they might have to fill out a document that and show up to the presentation in order to obtain a commission. We've dealt with issues like that for years now. During COVID, because there was such high demand for properties, we were seeing commissions offered in the MLS for less than 3%, 2%, 1%. That's why some people don't think that this lawsuit makes any sense, because it was always negotiable what the buyer's commission is. And certainly buyers themselves, when they weren't using a buyer's agent, would try to negotiate the listing agent's commission in order to pay less. So it's incumbent on you guys to understand your own value and then negotiate with your clients and with the other side to make sure you get paid. Buyers are able to finance. And if the seller is paying for a commission, the buyers aren't having to pay the full commission for a buyer, for a buyer's agent. That's something that you should be utilizing in your negotiations. Right now, that's how it works. In the future, that's how it's going to continue to work. The difference is that you might be asked to explain how that works now.
Right. The other thing I have to say, this is part of why I've been saying from the very beginning that this is a good thing. I don't know about you, but I hate it when I show a property and the MLS says 1% commission or 1.5. And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, that's not my value. I didn't negotiate that. I always hated that a seller and a seller's agent was dictating what I was earning when I was representing the buyer. So this enables us to earn what we know we're worth because we've already had that tough conversation. So Jennifer, if you're my client and you and I have already signed a buyer broker that I'm getting paid 3% in your purchase, and if we go to a listing that's only offering a 1% in the MLS, guess what? You're paying me that additional 2%. And I get to take home what I'm worth, which is the 3% that we decided in the very beginning. So this is part of why I think this is a very good thing. This is a good thing because the realtors that aren't serious, the realtors that are part-time, all of us have those friends that have their license and do a transaction maybe once a year. And we all know what that feels like. When we are all every day working in an industry to understand what's going on, and it's just so easy for somebody else to go and do that, that's not going to happen anymore. You have a question?
I kind of have a question.
Go ahead.
How do so in the buyer's consultation when we're bringing up the buyer brokers agreement, and this is just like what I'm thinking, right? And the buyer,
I'm going to explain it. Let me keep going because a little bit later in the presentation, I'm going to talk specifically about what the options are. Okay. So I think that'll help you. And that's part of what all of us are here today to learn about is how do we understand the options to correctly be able to communicate it correctly to our buyers and to our sellers. So let me keep going with the other ways, things that you can do to prepare. So you have to be able to talk to sellers about the various situations that can occur. This, in my opinion, and CJ, correct me if I'm wrong, this actually does become a little bit of a liability. And what I mean by that is we have to make sure that we are disclosing to sellers that they have options, that they can offer in the MLS 0%. They can offer 3%. And we, as the realtor, need to be able to say, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, if we put this in the MLS with 3% commission, you are going to get a lot more buyers coming through your doors versus if you put it in the MLS with 0. Now, again, understand this is all so new. I'm predicting that the Florida Association of Realtors, maybe the National Association of Realtors, are going to come up with disclosures that are going to be attached to the listing agreement. In my office, we are going to have a disclosure that tells your seller and clearly has them sign so that we can't get in trouble when eventually somebody comes back and says, well, the seller didn't know that they had an option of paying 0%. Let me also explain. This is an issue that the federal government has been looking at for years. This is nothing new. The Department of Justice, the Federal Trade Commission, they have been looking at this issue because guess what? They do not like a seller paying an agent who then pays for the buyer to be represented. That is too circuitous. What they want is they want a buyer's agent to be paid by the buyer. They want the seller's agent to be paid by the seller. They're not saying that they don't want us to get paid. Their issue is with who pays it. So I still believe that in the United States, we have the best version of advocacy when it comes to buyers and sellers transacting. Better than in Europe, better than in Australia, which they don't have these types of arrangements. So again, just understand, back to what I was saying earlier about the American consumer, also understand, if you think about the American consumer, what do they want, right? They want service. They want convenience. I heard this as an example that most of the American public uses these services like Uber Eats or delivery dudes, and they do that because they want the convenience and the service. They are willing to pay rather than go out and get the food themselves. So that same sort of mindset is part of why buyers still want you to service them. They still want to be able to call you with questions. And what do you suggest? You are just going to have to be able to explain and understand how you represent that value in that interaction. There are other questions?
Yeah, so Lydia asked, if we are the listing agents and a buyer calls, we can represent both. But now we only have 3% commission from the seller representing both. The answer to that is you have whatever commission you've negotiated with the seller on your listing agreement, just like now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so listing agents, nothing is changing.
Mm-hmm.
Except your seller may come to you saying, I don't want to pay a buyer's commission. Now it's on you to decide whether you're going to explain to them why they're going to get more buyers if they offer a buyer broker commission. There are tons of listing agents now that say, well, I'm charging a 6% commission, and we're going to offer 3% to the buyer side. But if I get both sides, I'm going to reduce the commission to 4% or 5%.
Right.
That's still the same. All of this is still the same, except there's a narrative out there that people are saying they don't have to pay buyer broker commissions. So, my recommendation to sellers and listing agents is to always offer a cooperating broker commission. You're going to sell the property for more.
But understand too, I think, Lydia, to sort of back up what CJ is saying, if that does happen and a buyer calls you and wants you to represent them, that again becomes a negotiation. So you can say, absolutely, I'm willing to do that. And this is what I charge for it. Think about any other professional. Do you think an attorney is going to do any sort of work without making sure that they get compensated? Right? It's a different industry entirely, but understand that it's going to come down to your ability to negotiate, this time for yourself. And so that's actually one of my next tips, is get better at negotiation. I think there are some more questions.
Yeah, so I think this leads into your next question too. So Alicia asks, if you're representing the seller and the buyer comes directly to the seller, wouldn't the agent just charge the buyer? And I'm assuming you mean the buyer's agent, not the listing agent. But we have to think about this from a number standpoint. If you have a $500,000 property, 3% of that is $15,000. Okay, so Alicia, you're talking about the seller's agent. Well, the seller's agent, if you're listing the property, you've negotiated with the seller to list the property.
Right.
So you're agreeing on a percentage with the seller. Mm-hmm. Are you agreeing at 6% and you're offering 3%, or you're agreeing at 4% and you're offering 1% or 2% or 3%? This has always been negotiable, and it still is.
It's the same thing. I think what you're asking is, even if the buyer pays it, it doesn't make a difference. At the end of the day, the seller's netting less. So so think about, right? So let's assume the offer is 100,000 and now the buyer is going to pay, let's say, and there's a 3% commission in there. So the seller is still netting 97,000.
Right. The big difference now is on a $500,000 property where, a commission for the buyer side is $15,000. Would we rather have that $15,000 coming from the sales price, so that the buyer can get financing and they're actually financing that commission? Or do you want the buyer to have to come up with $15,000 to be able to pay the buyer's agent commission? And as a listing agent, you need to be able to explain that to a seller so that they understand how the transaction works and where the money is coming from. Because it's not advantageous to the seller if the buyer has to come up with that money. Mm-hmm. You're going to have fewer buyers.
Mm-hmm. Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
So same scenario. I'm the listing agent. Buyer comes directly to me. Is there a place where, because I don't know if this would be like dual agency at this point or whatever, or because we are a transaction.
It wouldn't be dual agency unless you're a single agent, right?
But if I'm representing the seller, I got 3% from the seller.
Right.
Buyer comes to me.
Yeah.
Can I then charge that buyer?
Absolutely. That's part of your conversation. I'm happy to help you, Mr. Buyer. And in turn, I will charge this.
That's a percentage.
Absolutely.
Okay. The reverse scenario. Seller.
Yes.
Hey, I'm going to list your property for you.
Okay.
Okay. The seller's like, well, I don't want to pay a buyer's commission. Fantastic. That's fine.
Okay.
Dollar on the other end or 0%. But Mr. Seller, if I have to deal with this buyer,
right,
it's no longer 3%, is now 4%. Can I do that?
Absolutely. Nothing is changing in that way.
I'm just trying to say,
yeah.
Is there on the paperwork, can I do that?
Yes, you absolutely can. That's still something that's in the listing agreement. Alicia, to answer your question, so right now, you cannot finance an additional amount like for commissions, right? And so I think this is going to be something that lenders are going to change. This is something that the National Association of Realtors, one of the things that they do well is they lobby. Clearly they don't do well in a courtroom, but they do lobby well. And so what I mean by that is that what we need is NAR to lobby on our behalf, that a buyer is going to be able to go and finance if $100,000 is the purchase price and they want to offer, and they want a $3,000 commission on top of it, that they can then finance that additional amount. So that's something that everyone is talking about, industry heads, executives. I've heard it in multiple podcasts that is going to be something that we predict is going to happen. Right now, you technically cannot finance a commission. You can increase your offer amount, which is what CJ was saying. I predict in the future, lenders will allow commissions to be added as something to be financed. So funny, we were just talking about all this negotiation. The next thing that you need to do to prepare is to be better at negotiation. Go out there and get every book that you can. If you're in my office, I don't know if you remember, we read a book together a few years ago called Never Split the Difference. And that is a book by an FBI negotiator, one of the best books I've ever read. We have some trainings on it, by the way, in our office on PLU that help explain how you can be a better negotiator. Something else that you can do, go ahead and get the ABR. That's the accredited buyer representation. Why? Because when I'm sitting across from a buyer and they say to me, well, Jordana, what's different about you? Why should I sign this buyer broker? You need to be ready to articulate what's different. And one thing like having this designation is a great idea. It will help with your negotiation and it will help you stand out. Here's what not to do. You should not leave NAR. Why? Because right now, NAR hopefully is going to protect us by continuing to lobby. My hope is that they will settle and that will loop in all of us. Because these lawsuits, that Gibson lawsuit that was filed 30 minutes after the verdict, there's going to be many, many other copycat lawsuits unless there is a settlement that essentially includes all of us so that we are all protected and we can all move forward in our business.
Yeah, and from the standpoint of, legally what a settlement is, a lot of people have a negative opinion of what settlements are, but settlements mean that both parties essentially got what they wanted. So NAR will not settle unless they know that buyer broker commissions are protected. And this is coming directly from NAR. So if they do pursue a settlement and settlement negotiations, this is after they file appeals and there's these other lawsuits that are national lawsuits. One of the reasons why they're talking to the DOJ about their antitrust investigations and things like that. If NAR settles, it means it will be clearly outlined what everybody's roles and responsibilities are, but also they will be protecting your commissions. And that is their main goal. If they can't get what they want in a settlement, they won't settle and they will continue fighting.
Exactly. Okay, let's answer question number 3. What other changes can you expect? And again, I want to make the disclaimer that these are all predictions. These are opinions. This is not fact because we certainly can't predict the future. But why we're all here today is to be better prepared. So let's start with the question, how are buyers agents going to be paid? So again, I said this already, the government, the DOJ, the FTC, what they want is they want the buyer representing the buyer, the buyer's agent getting paid by the buyer and the seller's agent getting paid by the seller. They do not want to see the money routing around. So what options does that leave for us? First of all, this is really important that you understand. Nothing is changing in the sense that you can still get compensated in the MLS as we've always done. So yesterday, somebody asked me, well, Jordana, do I have to go back to my seller? I have an active listing. Do I have to go back and change it to 0? No, the seller already agreed to pay a cooperating agent. So there's nothing that needs to change with existing listing agreements. You also don't need to change this moving forward in the sense that you should continue to give sellers this as an option. Claudia, I'd love to list your home for you. I charge 3%. I suggest that you offer 3% to the cooperating agent. That is one of your options. Or you have another option. You can absolutely offer 0% in the MLS to cooperating agents. But understand, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, that what that means is that most likely that buyer is going to end up either lowering their offer because they're going to have to compensate their buyer, their agent, or they're going to include a stipulation in the contract. And the stipulation in the contract is going to say, you, meaning the seller, must pay my agent 3%.
Yeah, so let me comment on that because I've had this happen a couple of times where agents will put in the as-is contract in the additional terms what the commission is supposed to be for them. And I know a lot of agents write this on the bottom lines where it says cooperating broker and listing broker. This is something that I always recommend having a FAR commission agreement signed between the buyer's brokerage and the seller, and not just writing it in the as-is contract. And the reason for this, and I'm going to read directly from the as-is contract, it says, this contract shall not modify any MLS or other offer of compensation made by the seller or listing broker to cooperating brokers. So it says in the as-is contract that contract is not modifying the MLS. So I've seen it done before, but I have argued on the side of sellers that they don't have to agree to this in the contract. And I've argued on the side of buyers agents that they do get paid this commission. I would much prefer, and it's my advice to agents and brokers, to use a FAR commission agreement when they are changing the commission paid to a buyer that is offered in the MLS, because then that's a separate agreement between the seller and the buyer's broker. The as-is contract and the vacant land contract and the commercial contract, those are not contracts between the seller and the agents. They're contracts between the seller
And the buyer.
So always use a FAR commission agreement if you are going to try to change commission offered by a seller.
The other way around that, I believe, CJ, correct me if I'm wrong, but I heard this advice from another attorney who essentially said to write it as a stipulation, that this offer by the buyer includes the stipulation that the seller will compensate the agent this amount. Rather, and that you can, theoretically, you can use that in the additional terms. If you don't want to use the commission agreement that CJ is recommending is absolutely the best way to do this. If you would, if you want another option, that is another option, but you have to make it a stipulation because like CJ explained, the FAR bar as-is contract is a contract between the buyer and the seller. You as an agent are not a party in that contract.
And that's what I argued on behalf of a buyer one time, that this contract would not have been executed in this manner had the commission change, not been made.
Right.
And again, we want to have maximum protection for you guys to make sure that you get paid. And we don't want to enter into contracts that are going to end in a dispute. If the seller's willing to sign additional terms saying that they're changing a commission, they should be able to sign a one-page form that is also changing the commission, It's
part of why you also need to make sure now more than ever that you have the right support, that you have an attorney like CJ, or you have a broker that understands, that can help you have these tough conversations and understands the risks and the liability. Because if you don't do this right, you risk getting to closing and having $0 paid to you because you didn't do this right. The other,
just one other way to think about this too. If a seller's offering 0 commission, that sounds a lot like a for sale by owner to me that doesn't want to pay anybody, right? You guys have been dealing with for sale by owners for years. Roni, you're sitting right across from me. I know that you've used this commission agreement to do an open house at a for sale by owner, and you've gotten paid when that property sold. There's no difference.
That's exactly what I was going to say, because if I was, and this is just kind of like my head going, right? So my buyer, we've already agreed
on the payment because you have a buyer broker, right?
So now I'm looking at a listing. I'm like, okay, we're going to look at this listing, but if this listing, it shows that they're not paying commission, you're obligated to pay me a commission. We move forward on this. Maybe they agree, maybe they don't agree, whatever the case may be. Can I submit an offer, right?
Yeah, that's
the 13th or 14th page of the offer and say, hey, my buyer's paying me Can you say by
Yeah.
like 1% or half 1.5% of my commission, and you're asking the seller with the offer?
Okay, so that's a little
it
bit
some-
of a complicated question in the sense that it really comes down to how you want to conduct your business.
Okay.
And so with that being said, I don't know that I would ever tell a buyer, don't look at this property because they're
I'm not saying about
and then
what I'm
but
saying.
no, I understand. Let me finish. So I wouldn't tell that buyer, oh, if you make an offer, you have to then pay me. I wouldn't position it like that. You've already agreed to that. So there's no point in bringing it up again. Now, when you write that offer, your question is, would you have, let's say, the commission agreement in there that stipulates the seller pays you? Yes. The answer is absolutely. This is part of why I said earlier in this presentation, we have to get better at negotiating. We have to get better at understanding our value and understanding how it is involved in the transaction, because clearly it's going to get a little sticky, right? These are going to be tough conversations that we're going to have. This is part of why I'm predicting so many agents are going to leave. It's going to get harder, not easier. But I'm also predicting those of us that stay and that are good at what we do, we're going to get paid more. So let me keep going. The other option is that buyers are able to present an offer that includes the stipulation I just mentioned. Seller to credit the buyer 3% to be used to pay the buyer's agent commissions. So those are your three options when it comes to how you will get paid when you are working with a buyer. I don't have a slide for it, but I want to make sure you all know how to talk to a seller. Because when you talk to a seller and you're getting a listing agreement signed, you need to be able to essentially offer them the same options. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, you can choose to, one, pay a commission that includes a cooperating broker commission. Number two, you can include 0% to the cooperating broker. Number three, you can include a reduced commission to the cooperating broker. Or number four, you can choose to not have it in the MLS. That's an important document that, again, I believe that the Association of Realtors will create for us. In the meantime, you need to talk about it and or have your own brokerage document included with your sellers and your listings to protect you.
Yeah, this is some CYA language. You know, from a legal perspective, I think that the listing agreement states in there what the seller is choosing to do. The listing agreement says what the compensation is, and it states what they are offering to a cooperating broker. These lawsuits are basically trying to say that the sellers don't understand what they're signing. So either there's going to be an addendum that's created, or these forms are going to get a little bit clearer, and there's going to be almost like an opt-in, opt-out. Like, it's been explained to me that I am offering the other side a commission, or I don't want to offer the other side a commission. So I think these forms are going to get a little clearer in order, and that will be one of the changes coming from these lawsuits. Not that buyers agents will not be allowed to get commissions paid by the seller. You know, I truly believe that it is better for consumers if the seller is paying for the buyer agent commission. And there's going to be studies coming out from NAR and from all of these other organizations that compare us to different countries and things like that. They used Australia as a country in this lawsuit. And guess what? It's very hard to buy and sell property in Australia. It's much easier to do it here. Mm-hmm. So I think as time goes on, everyone is going to get a little bit more sophisticated in terms of how to be able to present this stuff to sellers and buyers, and you'll be able to utilize that information.
So actually yesterday, Home Services of America, which is one of the defendants in the case, they came out with a study. And if you guys want a copy of it, let me know, I'll send it to you. It's fascinating and it's sort of awful. And when I say awful, what I mean is it basically is this study, and the research shows the people that are going to suffer the most are the first-time home buyers, are the lower price points, because they are the ones that need representation the most, and they don't have deep pockets where they have an extra 3%. So that was one of the arguments that NAR made. Unfortunately, they didn't make it very well. That is one of the arguments that the defendants made. And again, like CJ was saying, all of these studies are basically going to show that the way that real estate works in the United States is the best way. And it's not necessarily, it's going to shift a little bit, but the shift is small. I mean, it's big, but it's small for those of us that get good at it. understand too, you guys know in the listing agreement, have you ever noticed there's a little section that says, check this box if you don't want to be on the MLS, or you don't want, and I'm always like, what is that? Like, who wouldn't want to be on the MLS? Well, guess what? That is a really old listing agreement that has not been changed since the internet first came to be. And so this isn't a bad thing. Reform is often a good thing. Also understand, when you guys go into Transaction Desk or Form Simplicity, do you know that originally all we had was the FAR bar contract? That's it.
Yeah.
We did not have addendums. All of those addendums came to be as people like us transacted and realized, you know what? It would be better if we had an addendum that disclosed the condo associations. So the same thing is going to happen here. There are going to be new addendums that pop up. There are going to be new boxes to check in the listing agreements. There's going to be new options in the buyer agreements. And that's all a very good thing if we handle it well. If we continue to sharpen our skills and show up to these meetings and have these conversations. Okay, so I think we have a couple slides left. What other changes? So these are the changes that I'm predicting. I believe that agents are no longer going to be required to join NAR, which, as you guys know, right now is a requirement if you're going to be in the MLS. I also believe that the code of ethics, unfortunately, that's not going to be something that's going to be as easily enforced. Think about commercial real estate. It's going to be a little bit more like that. Commercial realtors are not held to a code of ethics. They do not have an MLS. There are other ways that they sell property. I also predict that there are going to be more disclosures to home sellers that offer them options for compensation. Compensation and commission is going to become more negotiable than ever. I also predict that commission in the MLS eventually is going to go away entirely. Not yet, but I do believe in 12 months, 18 months, maybe 2 years, that it will be gone. Not that we're not going to get compensated, we will. It'll just be done differently. And lastly, we can no longer advertise this. This is an old way of advertising. My services are free because the seller pays. That's not necessarily the case. So I have 2 free giveaways. So the first one, the initial topic of this meeting was other things, not this, but we did not expect the verdict to come out this quickly. So I do have a giveaway, 10 ways to avoid being sued, which has sort of other topics in there. And then I have a 10-point plan. What are the things that you can do to prepare for this change? So some of the things that we spoke about today, I gave you some sort of like hints on it and some other things in there as well. So if you want a copy of either of these downloads, just email me directly. I'm glad to reply back to you with a copy of each of these documents. We have a couple minutes left, so we can continue to answer questions or talk about any of the things that we've already spoken about that you want me to reiterate or CJ to talk about. Let us know. Yes.
So hypothetically, I'm going back to this. Right?
Okay.
So listing has $1 percentage. I submit an offer, kind of asking, right?
Okay.
And then I submit with the offer, the
Commission agreement.
commission agreement.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, that's part of the offer. You can't.
What just happened?
Oh,
Oh, my screen just went away. Sorry, go ahead. My screen went blank.
yeah. So, they can't agree to the offer without signing that commission.
That's
submitted
a-
together. Because it's part of the offer, right?
It's a stipulation of the offer.
Yeah, and I would always reference a FAR commission agreement within. So the question for those of you that may not be able to hear is, if you're trying to change the commission that a listing agent or a seller is offering, and you're submitting a contract, like an as-is contract, I would write it in the additional terms as a stipulation, and I would submit a FAR commission agreement. The other option is to include a credit from the seller to the buyer. The reason why I don't like doing a credit from the seller to the buyer is because, do it if that's your last option, but that's less of a credit you can use towards other closing costs.
Yeah.
So we see credits from seller to buyer for closing costs, 3-2-1 buy downs for lenders, all sorts of things like that. I would prefer that you have a higher purchase price and pay the commission owed to the buyer's agent out of the purchase price,
Right.
just like normal. And again, these are strategies for when you see a commission offered in the MLS that's 0% or 1% or whatever it is. If you have a regular 3% commission offered in the MLS, which is still going to be common and standard, great. And listing agents, you should still be offering commission to buyer brokers because you're going to get more buyers. That's just the reality.
Absolutely.
That's why we all recommend doing this and have for decades. And that's why home prices continue to appreciate. That's why our real estate market continues to move and continues to be the envy of the world, because we do have these co-brokerage agreements and they're going to continue. But you guys as agents, if you're the ones that allow this narrative to take hold and start talking to buyers and sellers about how they don't have to offer this and this is what's going to happen and everything, and create your own barriers, then you are going to change things. And there's a very great quote from John D. Rockefeller, who used to be the richest person in the country, early 1900s. He was telling his son, who was negative about something, hey, you can turn this into your tombstone or a stepping stone. So which one are you going to choose? So you have a lot of negative information coming out here. Jordana sees this as an opportunity. Okay. Everybody always says we need to take advantage of chaos and we need to take advantage of change. Create opportunities out of this. Educate yourselves. And buyers and sellers are going to be asking you about this. So now you need to know how to answer it and not just roll over and say, well, I guess I won't get paid for all the hours and hours of work I put into this property.
Right. So it's been about an hour. I really appreciate everyone joining us today. We will continue to have these conversations because there will continue to be changes. In the meantime, I also want to say, keep doing what you're doing. Keep having good relationships, keep prospecting, keep reaching out and talking to more people. We still have a lot of people that we need to help when it comes to buying and selling. So don't get too caught up in this. Certainly don't let fear take over. Like CJ said, I'm a big believer that this is a very good thing, and this is absolutely an opportunity. So thank you guys so much. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to email me or call me directly. And that's all. Thanks, guys.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
you.